They asked his grandmother for her papers, in her own neighborhood, on the very street named after her husband. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. The air in Weaver's Crossing always smelled of jasmine and cut grass, a sweet, heavy perfume that clung to the humid Georgia afternoons. It was a scent Alara knew better than her own name. She'd lived in the same white clapboard house for 64 years, long before the wrought iron gates and the pretentious name were ever erected. Before it was Weaver's Crossing, it was just the land. Her land. Her husband, Joseph Weaver's land. His father's before that. She was 82, her hands gnarled and stained with the dark, rich soil of her garden, her back bent from a lifetime of planting things and watching them grow. That afternoon, she was on her knees, tending to her prize-winning azaleas that bordered the immaculate lawn, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her from the sun. The street in front of her house, a quiet lane that curved gracefully under a canopy of ancient oaks, was called Weaver's Way. It said so on the polished brass sign just a few feet from where she knelt. A golf cart hummed to a stop beside her. She didn't look up right away, assuming it was one of the neighbors coming to admire her blooms. Instead, a shadow fell over her. "Ma'am." The voice was young, clipped, and full of the cheap authority that comes with a uniform. She looked up, shielding her eyes. A man, no older than 30, stood over her. He wore the crisp beige shirt and trousers of the community's new private security firm, Aegis Protection. His name tag read Bryce. "Can I help you, young man?" Alara asked, her voice raspy from the heat. "I need to see your resident ID," he said, not as a request but as a demand. His hand rested near the taser on his belt. Alara blinked slowly. She looked from his flat, impassive face to the brass sign that bore her family name, then back to him. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. "Son, my face is my ID in this place." "That's not the policy," he replied, his tone unchanging. "We've had reports of non-residents loitering. We need to verify everyone." She saw it then. The way he looked at her old gardening dress, at the color of her skin. He wasn't seeing a homeowner. He was seeing a problem. The help. A trespasser. He didn't see the matriarch of the family that had owned this soil for over a century. He didn't see the woman who sold a portion of this land to the developers with the sworn, contractual promise that her family would always have their home here, undisturbed. "I am on my property, tending to my flowers," she said, her voice losing its warmth, replaced by a cool, hard dignity. "On a street named for my late husband." Bryce's eyes flickered to the street sign, a brief spark of confusion in his eyes before it was extinguished by procedure. "I still need to see your identification." Alara's hands, resting in her lap, clenched into fists, the dark soil pressing under her fingernails. The scent of jasmine suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. The humiliation was a quiet, cold thing, creeping into her bones. She had faced down snarling dogs in the days of Jim Crow. She had stared into the hateful eyes of men who thought she was less than human. She was not about to be broken by a boy in a golf cart. But she was tired. So deeply tired of having to prove she belonged in a world she had helped build. Her grandson, Samuel, was driving down from Atlanta to see her. He was a historian, a man who understood that the past was never truly past, it just wore different clothes. He was coming home to the smell of jasmine and his grandmother's cooking. He had no idea he was coming home to a war. Samuel's car, a modest sedan, hummed as he approached the gates of Weaver's Crossing. The keypad and camera felt like a scar on the landscape, an ugly appendage to a place that had always been open, free. He'd argued against the gate when the HOA first proposed it years ago, calling it a solution in search of a problem. Now, as he pulled up, he saw what kind of problem it was meant to solve. A different guard, this one older with a sour, downturned mouth, stepped out of the small guardhouse. He walked to Samuel's window with a heavy, deliberate gait. "Delivery?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning the car's interior before they landed on Samuel's face. "No, sir, visiting my grandmother, Elara Weaver," Samuel said, keeping his tone light. The guard's expression didn't change. "Name?" "Samuel Weaver." "ID?" It wasn't a question. Samuel handed over his driver's license. The guard took it, his eyes lingering on the photo, then on Samuel. He walked back to the guardhouse, the license held between two fingers as if it were contaminated. Samuel watched him in the rearview mirror. The guard was speaking into a radio, then typing something into a computer. The process took 3 minutes. 3 minutes while a white landscaping truck and a blue convertible with 2 blonde women in it were waved through with a friendly nod. No questions asked. Finally, the guard returned and handed the license back through the window. "She's expecting you." "She is," Samuel said, the words tight in his throat. The gate shuddered open. As Samuel drove through, he felt a slow burn starting in his chest. When he pulled into his grandmother's driveway, he saw her on the porch, sitting in her rocking chair, staring out at the street. She looked smaller than he remembered. "Grandma," he said, walking up the steps. She turned to him, and the smile she gave him didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sammy, you made it." "The guard at the gate gave me a bit of a hard time," he said, trying to sound casual. Her smile faded completely. "They have a habit of that." And then she told him. She told him about Bryce, about being asked for papers in her own yard. Samuel stood on that porch, the scent of his childhood all around him, and listened to his grandmother recount the quiet, soul-crushing humiliation. The burn in his chest ignited into a blaze. He looked out at Weaver's Way, at the ancient oaks his great-grandfather had refused to cut down. He looked at his grandmother's hands, still caked with the soil her family had tilled for generations. This wasn't just a slight. This was a desecration. The next few days were a study in 1,000 tiny cuts. Samuel's cousin, Maya, came over with her 2 young children. They were stopped at the gate. The guard, Bryce again, asked her to pull over and step out of the car. He questioned her for 5 minutes while her kids watched from their car seats, their faces pressed against the glass. A white Amazon driver in a branded van was waved through without a second glance. An old friend of Samuel's from college, a black architect named Ben, came to have dinner. He was told the address he gave didn't exist. Ben, a man who designed skyscrapers, had to call Samuel from the gate, humiliated, to confirm he wasn't a liar. Each incident was a small, sharp jab, a reminder. You are a guest here. You are temporary. You are under suspicion. Samuel complained. He called the number for Aegis protection listed on the HOA website. He was met with a bored, unhelpful voice that promised to look into it. He then emailed the HOA board president, a man named Arthur Harrington, whose smirking face was plastered all over the community newsletter. Harrington's reply came 2 days later, a masterpiece of condescending dismissal. "Mr. Weaver," it began. "Weaver's Crossing prides itself on its commitment to safety and security for all our residents. Aegis Protection is instructed to perform discretionary checks to ensure the tranquility of our community. While we regret any inconvenience you or your family may have experienced, their protocols are standard and are for the benefit of everyone. We trust you understand the importance of these measures. Discretionary checks. That was the phrase. A neat clinical term for prejudice. Samuel read the email 3 times. He felt the familiar, bitter taste of being managed, of being handled, of being told that his reality wasn't real. They weren't just ignoring him. They were gaslighting him. He walked out to the front porch, the email still glowing on his phone screen. His grandmother was there, watering her petunias. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace as if every motion was a prayer. He watched her, and the rage in his heart settled into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous: resolve. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't rage. He would do what he did best. He was a historian. He would dig. He would uncover the roots of this place, and he would use them to pull the whole rotten structure down. The fight began not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a camera. Samuel started documenting. Every time a family member or a friend arrived, he filmed. He set up a discreet camera aimed at the street, capturing the gate in the distance. The evidence mounted with sickening predictability. His black friends were stopped, questioned, their IDs scrutinized. His few white acquaintances and every white service worker sailed through with a smile and a wave. The pattern was so blatant, so shameless, it was almost comical. He took his findings back to the HOA. This time, he sent a certified letter with screenshots and timestamps. The response was even more insulting. A letter from the HOA legal counsel warning him against harassing the security staff and making baseless accusations of racial bias. They threatened him with fines for violating community bylaws, though they never specified which ones. They were trying to bury him in paper. They were trying to exhaust him. They thought he was just one angry man who would eventually give up. But Samuel wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. He spent his nights in the county archives, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. He wasn't just looking for his family's history. He was looking for the history of the deal. He found the original development plans for Weaver's Crossing, drawn up in the late 1980s. And there, buried in the fine print of the land sale agreement between his grandfather, Joseph Weaver, and the Development Corporation, he found it. A covenant. A clause Joseph, a shrewd and forward-thinking man, had insisted upon. The covenant granted the Weaver family and their direct descendants perpetual, unimpeded access to their ancestral homestead. It explicitly stated that no future homeowners association or governing body could enact rules that unduly burdened, hindered, or infringed upon the peaceful enjoyment and free passage of the Weaver lineage. It was ironclad, written by a black lawyer from Atlanta who knew that a handshake in the South needed to be backed by the full, unambiguous force of the law. The HOA, in its rush to build a fortress of exclusivity, had either never read the fine print or, more likely, had assumed no one would ever remember it. They had assumed the past was dead and buried. Armed with the covenant, Samuel felt a shift in the ground beneath his feet. He was no longer a resident complaining about policy. He was the heir to a foundational promise they had broken. He didn't go back to the HOA, not yet. His next step was to understand the enemy. He researched Aegis Protection. They were a regional firm with a trail of lawsuits in other states, all with similar themes: excessive force, racial profiling, harassment. They were cheap, which is why HOA on a budget hired them. Their contract, which he obtained through a friend who worked in municipal contracts, contained the same vague language about discretionary checks. It was a legal loophole big enough to drive a truck through, and they drove it through every day. He started talking to his neighbors. Not just the other black families, who nodded with a weary sense of recognition when he told his story, but everyone. He approached them at the community pool, at the mailboxes, while they walked their dogs. He didn't lead with anger. He led with curiosity. "Have you noticed the new security protocols?" he'd ask. "How do you feel about the gate?" Most of the white residents were oblivious. "They seem fine to me," one woman said. "They're always so polite." "They always wave me right through," another man added with a shrug. Samuel would just nod. "Interesting. They stop my family every time. My grandmother, too. She's 82. He would watch their faces change. The flicker of discomfort, the dawning awareness. He wasn't accusing them of anything. He was simply presenting a reality that was different from their own, and letting them sit with the dissonance. A few, to his surprise, grew angry on his behalf. An older white woman named Mrs. Gable, who had lived there for 20 years, was horrified. "They stopped Alara," she gasped. "In her own yard. Arthur Harrington will be hearing from me." A small, quiet coalition was forming. He had the law on his side, he had the evidence on camera, and now he had allies. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It was usually a dull affair, a dozen or so residents arguing about lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. This year, Samuel decided it would be different. He sent an email to the families who had shared his concerns. He told them the date and the time. He didn't tell them his full plan. He just said one thing: be there. It's time they listened. The community clubhouse was a sterile, beige room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the 5 members of the HOA board sat, looking self-important. Arthur Harrington, a man with a pink, fleshy face and a voice that oozed condescension, tapped a microphone. "All right, let's get this annual meeting started," he announced to the room. It was more crowded than usual. Nearly 50 people were present, a mix of faces, young and old, black and white. Harrington noticed, a brief flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he plastered on a practiced smile. At the back of the room, standing with their arms crossed, were Bryce and the older, Scior-faced guard from the gate. They were there as a show of force, a reminder of who was in charge of safety. They moved through the agenda with excruciating slowness. The treasurer's report. A debate about new speed bumps. A complaint about someone's dog. Samuel sat quietly in the 3rd row, a leather-bound folio resting in his lap. His grandmother was at home, but Mrs. Gable sat next to him, her hand gripping her purse tightly. The other families he'd spoken to were scattered throughout the room, a silent network of shared experience. Finally, Harrington looked at his watch. "That brings us to the open forum. Each resident will have 3 minutes to voice any concerns. Please keep it civil." His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Samuel stood up. He walked to the microphone at the front of the room. He was calm, his posture straight, his voice even when he spoke. "Good evening. My name is Samuel Weaver." Harrington gave a tight, dismissive nod. "Mr. Weaver, you have 3 minutes." Samuel didn't look at Harrington. He looked at the residents. "I'm not here to talk about speed bumps or lawn care. I'm here to talk about the history of this land. Before it was Weaver's Crossing, it was a farm. Before that, it was just woods and a creek. For over 150 years, it was owned by one family. My family." A murmur went through the room. Harrington shifted in his seat, his smile gone. My great-grandfather, Isaac Weaver, bought the first 100 acres after he was emancipated. He farmed it with his bare hands. My grandfather, Joseph Weaver, is the man this very street is named after. He paused, letting the words sink in. When my grandfather sold most of this land to the developers, he did so with a promise. A legally binding promise recorded in the county deed that his family would live here forever, unburdened and unhindered. He opened the folio. He placed a copy of the old hand-drawn map of the original Weaver farm on a projector. Then he placed the covenant beside it, its dense, legal text glowing on the screen behind him. This covenant guarantees my family free and peaceful enjoyment of our home, a covenant this board and its hired security has violated repeatedly. Harrington slammed his gavel down. Mr. Weaver, this is not the forum for personal grievances or historical lectures. Your time is. I'm not finished, Samuel said, his voice dropping, cutting through Harrington's interruption like a razor. The room went silent. Even the guards in the back shifted on their feet. You speak of policy, Samuel continued, his eyes locking onto Bryce. You speak of security. Let me show you what your security looks like. He clicked a remote. The projector screen changed. The first video played. His cousin Maya's car pulled over, Bryce's voice cold and demanding, her children's faces confused and scared in the window. Click. The next video. His friend Ben at the gate being told he doesn't exist. Click. A landscaping truck driven by two white men being waved through. Click. A food delivery driver, a young black man being forced to show his ID and empty his pockets. Click. And finally, the video that made the room gasp. His 82-year-old grandmother, on her knees in her own garden, being interrogated by a man young enough to be her grandson. The air in the room became thick with shame. Faces flushed. People looked at the floor, at each other, anywhere but at the board. Mrs. Gable was openly weeping. Discretionary checks, Samuel said, the words dripping with ice. That's what you called this. But there is nothing discretionary about this. This is a pattern. This is a choice. This is the definition of harassment and racial profiling, and it has been happening under your leadership. Harrington was sputtering. This is a training issue, an unfortunate isolated. It is not isolated, a voice shouted from the back. One of the other black homeowners, a father of two, stood up. They stopped my son last week, accused him of vandalism because he was riding his bike after dark. Another person stood. They followed my wife home from the grocery store. Then Mrs. Gable stood, her voice trembling with rage. And you did nothing, Arthur. I called you myself after I heard what happened to Alara and you dismissed me. The room erupted. The carefully constructed civility shattered. Harrington banged his gavel, but no one was listening. He had lost control. The guards, Bryce and his partner, looked pale, their smug authority stripped away, leaving only two men exposed in a room full of their mistakes. Samuel waited for the noise to subside. Then he delivered the final, killing blow. Per the community bylaws, he announced, his voice carrying over the din, I have here a formal motion, co-signed by 25 resident households, to immediately terminate the contract with Aegis Protection for gross negligence and violation of community standards. He held up a thick stack of papers. I am also filing a motion of no confidence in this board for failing to uphold its fiduciary and ethical duties. And finally, he looked directly at Bryce, then at Harrington. Tomorrow morning, My attorney will be filing a civil rights lawsuit against both Aegis Protection and the Weavers Crossing HOA, citing the original land covenant you chose to ignore. Checkmate. Harrington stared at him, his mouth agape, his face the color of spoiled ham. The guards in the back were frozen, their faces a mask of pure shock. They hadn't just been challenged, they had been dismantled, publicly, methodically, historically. Samuel looked out at the faces of his neighbors, no longer just a crowd but a community awakened. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. He had simply brought the truth, and the truth was a weapon they had never seen coming. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA meeting ended in chaos, with Harrington and the board members shouting to be heard over a chorus of angry and ashamed residents. The vote to terminate the Aegis Protection contract passed with a staggering majority right there on the floor. Bryce and his partner were escorted from the property not as guards, but as terminated employees, their faces a portrait of public humiliation. They didn't even make it to the gate before their final paychecks were being processed. Within a week, Arthur Harrington and 2 other board members resigned. The lawsuit Samuel filed became a local news story, not because of the drama, but because of the history. The story of the Weaver Covenant, of a promise made generations ago to protect a black family's legacy, resonated deeply in a nation grappling with its own broken promises. The HOA, facing indefensible evidence and immense legal pressure, settled quickly. The terms were not just financial, they were structural. A new security firm was hired, one with a stellar record and a diverse staff. Their protocols were rewritten from scratch, with a new community oversight committee, co-chaired by Samuel Weaver and Mrs. Gable, given final approval on all policies. The term discretionary check was permanently banned, but the most significant change was the one you couldn't see on paper. The gate was still there, but it felt different. The residents started talking to each other more. The quiet, unspoken lines that had divided the neighborhood began to blur. People brought Alara flowers and pies, apologizing for their silence, for their ignorance. They would sit on her porch and listen to her stories about the land, about what it was like before all the new houses and manicured lawns. They were learning the history they lived on top of. A few months later, on a warm autumn evening, Samuel sat with his grandmother on her porch swing. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the yard. The scent of jasmine had returned, no longer suffocating but sweet and familiar. Children, black and white, chased fireflies on the lawn of Weaver's Way. A new security guard, a kind-faced black woman who knew every resident by name, drove by in her golf cart and gave them a warm, genuine wave. Alara waved back. She turned to Samuel, her eyes clear and bright. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly. "He always said this land had a soul, that it remembered everything. You just had to know how to listen." Samuel looked out at the street, at the houses, at the tall oaks standing like silent sentinels against the twilight sky. They hadn't won a battle against a few ignorant guards or a corrupt HOA board. They had won something much bigger. They had reminded the world that you cannot build a community by erasing its foundation. You can only build on top of it. They wanted to build a wall around us. We showed them we were the foundation.